Well, look, thanks very much everyone for coming out tonight. Really, really appreciated. And a huge thank you to Edelman's as well for offering up this fantastic venue for us. Without that, we'd probably be somewhere a lot more ropey without free booze. So, big thank you. I'm not going to do an enormous plug at the start. We'll get into the good stuff, but I would just like to quickly explain why you're all here, really. Gerald Bowie, the man sitting in the corner, is the chief exec of the IBP, and it stands for the International Building Press, and it's an organisation that basically it lays on awards for journalists. It kind of it's for all journalists who write about the built environment, but it's sort of kind of become a bit of an umbrella for trade magazine journalists generally. And we've got quite a broad church tonight. We've got, I think, about a third of the room are City students, and we've sort of set up a sort of partnership with City University, thanks to Barbara, who is somewhere in the audience. Hi, Barbara. And the idea behind that is so that City students have a chance to meet potential future employees and actually have a beer with them and find out what it's like to work on a trade magazine, and also meet some people at the top of their game. And equally, so that those working on trade magazines can get an early opportunity to meet some of the next, cream of the crop coming through. So that's one part of the room. In terms of the broad house of journalists, we've got people from Inside Housing, from where I'm from, Property Week, Estates Gazette. I think we've got Architects Journal, Construction News. We've got some people from Dezeen, I think. Sorry? Building, yes. And we may have a few other people from some other trade magazines as well, and also some very well-known freelancers. So we've got quite a broad house tonight. And we've also got some of the top PR people in the built environment as well. So the idea is, first of all, we'll hear from some of the top investigative journalists in the country right now about how they do what they do. And then afterwards, we will pile across the road to the pub and hopefully have a bit more fun informally. So I'm not going to tell you much about the IBP because you can read it here, but it's a fantastic organisation, and it lays on great awards. It's a really good thing to be a part of. So hopefully we'll be involving you guys in a lot more of these sort of events. And as part of that, this is my one and only plug. Please follow IBP on Twitter. And I put the request in the original invite, but all trade magazine journalists, please get involved with the LinkedIn group, because we want to lay on more events like this, and the way that we're going to work out who we'd like to be there is through the LinkedIn group. So we want everyone to have a voice and to tell us what they want to actually hear. I probably should have mentioned this is being laid on by the IBP Futures group, which is the idea is to kind of get a bit of crossover in generations and look at the next generation of journalists and help everyone who's actually working on the shop floor learn from the best. So without further ado, I will introduce you to our fantastic panel. Really grateful for all of them coming out tonight. First of all, we've got James Ball from BuzzFeed, and probably better known for his time at The Guardian, but also, sorry, he's only been at BuzzFeed for a month, so it was a month, something like that. Pretty much. Yeah, so he broke two of the biggest stories last year, the HSBC file leaks, and then before that he was the man behind a lot of the Snowden leaks as well. So we're going to find out a little bit about how he went about handling really sensitive data and national secrets. And then we've got George Arbuthnot from the Sunday Times. George has produced some incredible work on modern day slavery that got him shortlisted for the Orwell Prize, and since then I believe he's also been on the back of Seb Blatter. Is that right?
Yeah, a bit of that.
A bit of Blatter, and also the Sunday Times recent scoops on the athletics doping, which hopefully you've all read, but we'll go into in a bit more depth later on. And finally, we've got Nick Mathiasen from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Any trade magazine journalist working in the built environment sector should be familiar with his work. He's done some incredible bits on the housing crisis, revealing how developers are using viability assessments to escape their affordable housing quotas, which inevitably I'm more interested in than perhaps everyone else in the room, but it's incredible work. And he has also been shortlisted for the Orwell Prize. And I think that every one of our speakers has today been shortlisted for Press Gazette Awards as well, so they're probably all up against each other, but we're keeping it friendly. So yes, for now. So the format is we're going to get these guys to speak a little bit for 20 minutes, but briefly on their backgrounds, and then their sort of two biggest stories, how they went about landing them, and what the actual nuts and bolts process of their investigations were, and what we could take home and apply ourselves at magazines where perhaps we don't have the resource of having a Sunday Times Insight team or an incredibly high-powered BuzzFeed team, or indeed an entire bureau. So we'll then go on to questions at the end, and hopefully you'll all be full of them. So without further ado, by the way, I should probably also mention I made James some slides, so he didn't do what you're about to see. So on that note, the other thing I should mention is that both James and Nick previously worked at trade magazines. That's not entirely a coincidence. So over to you, James.
So yeah, I guess it sort of makes a bit of sense to try and say how I ended up sitting where I am and working where I am. And I did a weird sort of first version of the investigations course at City, where you also did the magazine course at City. So I kind of came through that and sort of met a lot of the B2B mags and consumer mags and sort of worked with those students sort of the whole way through. And sort of like sort of most City students, went for a couple of the graduate schemes, was not really thinking properly about that stuff, and was completely broke the whole year I was doing City because I was sort of self-funding and had no money. So I ended up doing shifts at Press Gazette while I was still a student, which is a terrible idea, and any of you who are currently students shouldn't try and do it because you miss classes and go mad and have silly fights with your very lovely tutors who are right and you're wrong, even though I would have told you the other way around then. One of the City tutors is in the audience, so I have to, stress that. But one of the kind of nice things about it, I was doing shifts at Press Gazette, and you just sort of start to see a little bit about something that I liked about trade journalism as sort of a new journalist, and it was you're in a small newsroom and you can be useful. If you have an idea, there's not 60 other journalists, one of whom definitely had it, there's sort of 5 or 10, and they might actually be quite grateful of it. I've always been a bit of an FOI nerd and a numbers nerd, and I got interested in FOI backlogs, and so sort of sent something to the Information Commissioner's office asking about it, half thinking I'd use it for an assignment. Showed sort of one of the reports at Press Gazette when it came in, and it ended up splashing the paper because it's still printed then. And so I had a first splash almost sort of through blind chance from just kind of actually at least just spotting a niche there. But it got me a start to it. It got me sort of seeing that an exclusive story is not quite as difficult as you sort of think it is before you've written one. And so sort of I was looking out as I graduated and just trying to sort of see what I wanted to do, and I ended up accepting a job at The Grocer at Interview because the guy who actually still edits it is just a ludicrously strong personality who essentially sort of did an interview, made me write a sort of a results story there and then at the interview, then told me how I'd missed the lead, structured it wrong, got nothing right on the style, had I never read the magazine, did I not understand this, grudgingly conceded the questions I'd put down that I'd asked the CEO or the comms person were good. I'm expecting to be kicked out, and he offers me the job on the spot, asked if I can start the Monday, and said he has to hear there and then. And then asked what I was considering as the starting salary, to which I brilliantly negotiated, well, I couldn't actually live on less than the minimum one. And so he very generously offered me the minimum salary in the range. I've not got much better at that, actually. But actually, the thing I found was a weekly mag was just brilliant, and especially on an area where the nationals are very interested. Because we would have a meeting on a Tuesday morning, and anything, we wouldn't be out on the newsstands till a Friday, and we were incredibly paywalled. It wasn't very digital. It's still not brilliantly digital now, to be honest, but they would argue otherwise, I'm sure. But if you had something like annual results or a press release or something like that, if it was any good, it would be in a national newspaper before you're there, and all of the interested audience would be there. So you lived or died by the exclusives you offered on a Tuesday morning. And that gets you thinking laterally about anything you can bring in, anything you can do. And I was the least sourced person on the team because I was new, I had no connections, I had no nothing. But they paid a fortune to collect pricing information on supermarkets, and I'm good at Excel spreadsheets. That gets taught now. It got taught a bit even when I was at City, but I actually knew it because I used to work in a council in the summer holidays doing risk assessments, which is the most boring job you can do on the planet. The most dangerous thing in most councils is falling gravestones. They get graded as if they're nukes. Honestly, it's weird. But that actually meant you could get an exclusive story looking at this sort of cool pricing data, and everyone cares about supermarkets doing fake offers or ripping people off or booze being cheaper than it's been for 10 months. And the editor looking to get attention was always quite happy if the Nationals picked up citing the grocer. Now, it upped the metrics, it sort of did quite well for him, and it got us on sort of local radio or sometimes Farming Today or the BBC. So it kind of got me quite quickly into sort of that mindset. And actually, just the subject matter is all that's changed since it, and I've learned more tricks. And so I used to spend my weekends sending out a bunch of flyers on anything that wasn't grocery to try and sell to the Sunday Times or the Cindy or the News of the World, which I had to keep quite quiet about when I was at the Guardian, because it wasn't the friendliest of relations between the papers then. And I'd find I could sell that in, and every now and then it worked. I even managed to get a Sunday Telegraph splash by going through NHS risk registers, which felt like vindication for very boring council jobs. The splash, I'm afraid, was swine flu's NHS not ready for swine flu pandemic, we're all going to die, which obviously I was completely vindicated on. So that kind of meant weird, what might seem quite weirdly for some places, but when I put a CV in when the Bureau was just being founded, we used to work together, didn't we, Nick?
Actually, we did.
So we almost overlapped, didn't we? I thought we overlapped.
Oh, you'd long sailed away.
Oh, damn it. We nearly worked together. But I was kind of the second hire of the Bureau, partly by virtue of being cheap, and it was a sort of very much startup charity kind of thing there, but also I had the CV for it. And then through hook and crook, we got the WikiLeaks Iraq files and produced that for Channel 4. And I went within, honestly, about 6 months from doing the weekly roundup of commodity prices from the grocer to trying to produce the dispatches on WikiLeaks. And it was similar. The stress level was insanely higher, but the process very similar. And I'll cover the rest of the CV stuff so we can talk about the more interesting story stuff after that. I jumped to WikiLeaks. I essentially got a sort of 2 a.m. texted offer from Assange. If you want to work on the next thing, which we knew was the state cables, you're going to have to come and work for WikiLeaks. And then went on to, depending what you read on the internet, work for WikiLeaks, become an MI5 informant against WikiLeaks, intern for WikiLeaks and get fired for a gross disciplinary infraction. It's never been spelled out to me what the gross disciplinary infraction was, but I'm assuming it was bad. And then I went to the Guardian, and because it says equals Pulitzer Prize, I did not make this slide. Worked on the Snowden stuff because I'd worked on WikiLeaks. And so it was quite an incremental thing where just by having a niche newsroom skill and kind of a bit of practice in using it, it sort of ratcheted up through stories until I ended up, weirdly, in a newsroom as big as The Guardian, being a good person to throw in when they got the Snowden stuff. And then essentially Janine Gibson moved to BuzzFeed, where they're expanding ridiculously. We've got a newsroom of about 15 at the minute. By Christmas it'll be 30, and by Easter I think it'll be 40. and that's not the direction of most newsrooms at the minute. So kind of when the offer came to try that out, I kind of thought I might give that a go. But I guess Snowden is more interesting than me. So I don't quite know what to say about this one, so I'll sort of quite quickly go through it, and if anyone's got questions, just throw them at the end. But I mean, Snowden I got put on essentially because I'd done WikiLeaks, and it's that prior experience thing. And in all honesty, if anyone tells you they would know how to handle a story like that, you could be the most experienced person in the world and just not know what's there. They'd really... Getting documents out of an intelligence agency had pretty much last happened at the Pentagon Papers. And that's because the guy photocopied them at night and carried them out in a wheelbarrow. I mean, this was just unprecedented. It came to us initially in a trickle. And the initial concerns is, what do you do to be sensible about this? How high is the level of risk? You pull in a lawyer who immediately tells you there's no precedence. Here are all the laws the government might decide to define you're breaking. You fly back, like this was in America, you fly back to the UK and you get the same legal briefing with a whole different set of laws you might be breaking. And no one quite knows if the government's got to decide to try and force that or not. But it's got to depend on the public interest you can demonstrate by publishing, how responsible you are, what the government makes of what you're doing, whether you're talking and redacting responsibly, whether you're looking after the information. So that's the sort of strange and unusual bit of it. As the other bit's the information security. And I do sort of encourage anyone where you might be getting near criminality, or where you might be getting near sources who are really telling you something quite serious that they could be fired for, it's worth knowing the basics of what to do on email, what to just sort of tell people to keep off. I mean, if nothing else, there's just the simple things of someone who's a confidential source, don't let them talk to you from a work computer, from their work. Don't let them ever use a work address, don't let them ever use a work phone. Believe it or not, that's almost never followed, and most cases that's actually enough security. But it's worth sort of knowing. But on Snowden, we went from kind of me getting very serious eye rolls for saying people should leave their phones outside the room, to, you know, Alan Rusbridger wandering in a room and immediately unplugging all the electronics and sort of scowling if anyone had brought a bag in, and sort of doing everything on notepads. So we got quite good quite fast as we sort of saw more of what we were looking at. But the rest of it is just the core stuff, is trying to work with the source, vet the source, look at what the material's telling you, and then looking at how to actually try and break it up into relatable stories. I mean, I think people look at something like Snowden and assume that you've just got a whole bunch of stories and why did you wait 4 months between the two of them? But we had to choose the narrative, we had to break it up, we had to try and make sense of it. And essentially it's an intranet as much as anything, what we could see. And so everyone else knows what they're talking about. So it's like reading the middle 10 pages of a book and trying to piece together everything that happened before and afterwards and all the subtext, and then to not take one sentence and go, you can read the sentence of it and assume that the government is secretly and illegally monitoring every word everyone in Britain says. And then you check the context and check it, and it turns out they're talking about a subsample of 200 people, it's in a completely different country, it was for a test project and it was fake data. And so some of the stories that are out there, none of the ones The Guardian did, and I can really vouch for that, are actually complete BS. But most of what we did was shooting down our own stories and trying to be very careful and really piecing together a jigsaw. I think the only other unusual thing about that to mention was just you couldn't talk to outside experts. Anyone who'd seen it was still security cleared and therefore not allowed to talk to you. They could lose their whole livelihood even just for giving you advice or chatting to you. And anyone who hadn't seen it was speculating in the same way you were. And so it was really one way you just had to sit down and sort of work with the outside experts you could as far as you could, but otherwise just really try and piece it all from docs, which nothing else has ever been like that. Sorry, I don't know how helpful it is because it's such a weird story.
To what extent did did Edward Snowden understand all the story? Was he quite sort of forthcoming with what he thought you should be covering?
He was very driven by the fact what he'd seen, and he had some specific stuff. So I don't know how much people remember of it, but the very first story was a Verizon secure warrant showing domestic mass surveillance. That and the key sort of PRISM slides were the specific things sort of Snowden sent over as these are the immediate and most important things. These are why I'm doing it. The rest of it, he was kind of, I think this, and this is interesting, but I know I'm too close to it. I'm part of the intelligence community. I'm not a journalist. I don't know what's in the public interest and what's not, and what's a breach and what's not. I know I've seen enough that I very strongly believe something's wrong, and here's the specifics. But I don't know the rest of it, and that's on you.
So to what extent did you've got those middle 10 pages, what extent did you say, Edward, you read the whole book? What does that mean?
There were bits, you would sort of bounce now and then, but we were aware, for us and for Snowden, that any sense that he was pulling the strings or was sort of controlling the narrative would be quite problematic. When it came to the GCHQ stuff, the one thing he kind of said was, look, you need to look into tempora. That's the weird thing going on in the UK. We honestly had a lot of tempora confusion. It was the most Guardian pathetic mix-up, honestly. But tempora was like the Sky Plus program for the internet that Britain runs. He said, we couldn't do this, and you guys can. But that was literally all we got from Snowden on that story. Especially because that was just as he was starting to get in the Moscow airport stuff, and he was at his least accessible. I mean, it's communication was not clear. The other thing with this was you couldn't email, you couldn't phone, you didn't really trust even secure messengers. So if you wanted to talk to someone in London, you flew to London. If you wanted to talk to someone in New York, you flew to New York. Now, we worked at a paper based in London, so we were researching most of the stories after about the first 6 weeks out of New York, because the UK government had to smash the hard disks over here. And Glenn Greenwald, who had sort of the main source relationship, lived in Rio and refused to enter either Britain or America. So about 3 of us ended up spending 18 months of our lives just flying between London, Rio and New York, which I'm sure sounds great, but not so much. And I can tell you, in the middle of summer, like Northern Hemisphere summer, Rio is just having 6-day thunderstorms. So you get in jet-lagged as fuck after 6 days of kind of being stuck in a Marriott with no external light, all your windows shut, sitting looking at laptop screens and arguing. Constant thunderstorm outside. You get back and everyone's, how was Rio? And yeah.
So how many of you were actually assigned to Snowden?
On the stories sort of through the whole period, there were about 5 core reporters, and the lawyers actually capped that quite early, essentially saying, look, you've got enough people. But to actually get it done, we had legal support, we had other reporters who were talking to experts, who were getting reaction, who were following up. You know, we had people helping with the social side of it. We had a ton of Alan Rusbridger was very heavily involved, Janine Gibson, Stuart Miller, just constantly having to live and breathe this. So you had a sort of core reporting team, really as small as about 4 or 5, but relying on the wider resources of a big paper, you know, needing maybe about sort of 20, 30 people on and off, who we just couldn't have done it without. But no, like 5 of us got named on the award, which was nice.
Always nice. So how do you break that up, and how do you plan that? I mean, what, you know, day one, somewhat, you know, and also working with Glenn, you know, Greenwald. I mean, you know, you often get the impression, if you follow him on Twitter, that he's quite an opinionated guy. He's definitely got an agenda. Was that uncomfortable?
I mean, he's not a reporter. He was a lawyer and then a comment writer, and so for him to, he was the most instrumental person in. Certainly in America, Snowden was on a scale far bigger than it was here. You know, this guy who was not a professional journalist landed the biggest story of the decade, certainly in America. And yes, he can be as spiky as he seems on Twitter if you've ever followed him. But the sort of refreshing thing about Glenn was, like, the hardest bit with him was the first 48 hours before we published the first story. And he just didn't trust us, that we wanted to get it out as much as he did. And so when we're asking for a few more hours or a few more days or to check it out, he's thinking we've chickened out on government pressure, or we're going to sell him out, or we're going to, like, the degree of worry there. And he was in Hong Kong at the time, we were in New York, Alan was in midair and totally off grid. You had MI5 ringing the most senior editors they could find in the UK, waking them up to see if any of them could overrule Janine Gibson sitting in New York. And they're ringing, not saying, we're telling you not to, just going, MI5's on the phone asking if we can stop you doing this. Just so you know, MI5 stay, don't publish. You're sitting with the journalist, like you had me as a reporter in the room, and another sort of news editor going, this story's true, it's right, this was the Verizon one, it's a surveillance memo, there's no details in, there's no locations, there's no personnel, the story's true if you want to publish it. You know, we'll vouch for it. You had the Hong Kong sort of reporters going, Glenn going, look, if you're going to chicken out for the government, I'm just going to publish it myself. And your editor-in-chief is in a plane flying over and you don't have time to wait for him to land. That was probably Janine Gibson's hardest moment of her career, I would guess. And I don't know what I would do in that situation, but she clicked publish. So, yeah.
I mean, from a moral point of view, did you? I mean, you know, most of the debate outside of the news angle is the Guardian right to publish this material? Were you sure from the very start it was the right thing to do? And I mean, did you feel a little bit hostage to situations like that with Glenn saying, "I'm going to do or die"? You know,
if we'd have been in a position where we were thinking we don't want to publish this bit of it because it puts someone at risk, it would have been a very different decision and an easy one. We had a lot of discussions about level of detail to publish, what not, and pretty much every single story we would have a conversation, sometimes a very unfriendly conversation, with GCHQ and NSA, and if they could give something they didn't want in it, and a good reason, we would almost always follow it. The main one we didn't was they asked us not to publish the encryption story at all. And that was actually one of the most significant, and we were doing it with the New York Times, and Jill Abramson, who was editing it then, and Janine and Alan all agreed that we kept out various specifics that they asked for, and everything you leave out, you pissed off a whole bunch of people. Everything you put in, you pissed off a whole bunch of people. But for the overall story, they really were very confident at that point, even though it was quite a sort of techie issue. There was an overriding public interest. But I mean, we've got family in the UK, in the US, you know, everyone's grounded in these things. We are as worried about terrorism, as worried about law enforcement, as, you know, we hate paedophiles as much as the next person. We don't want to make things harder to catch the bad people, but we thought there was a real debate that was being stopped and some serious democratic issues, and so that did inform it. But no, there was a lot of stuff in there that would have just made amazing stories. If you just mined it for material or the odd sort of anecdote that's found out, we could still be doing front pages that actually would just be great stories. We were on the tightest orders to be very disciplined and keep it about surveillance itself and the methods, and not just trawling it for fun stuff, which is a real shame.
Look, James, we could talk about Snowden literally for hours because it's amazing, but I'm conscious of time and the fact that, unfortunately for everyone else in the room, you've also done the HSBC files, which I say unfortunate because most of us haven't done one of those yet. So you've had Assange, you've had Snowden, and now you've gone on to HSBC. The reason you effectively seem to be a data journalist who does a lot of investigations. Is that right, or are you an investigative journalist who happens to have data skills?
It's sort of ended up sliding the other way now. It's probably more, I spend a lot of time now doing stuff that doesn't have a data element, but being good at maths is actually my biggest asset as a journalist. And by the standards of people who are actually good at maths, I'm terrible. But no one goes to the newsroom going, you know what I love? Accountancy. So, you're the person in a room who hates it the least. Or the one who can actually go, no, that's just that, and you factor that, which also means you're the insufferable little know-it-all. And, trying, I usually fail, but trying not to be a dick about it is pretty crucial, especially if someone asks you, if someone's actually getting interested and asking you a maths question or trying to get into it. The key thing is that is awesome, that is a brilliant attitude, and it's not do you know as much as I do, because if you don't, you shouldn't bother. It's okay, here's some stuff that'll start you off, here's how to look at this. Oh, don't worry about that, we all screw that up, here's how to do it. Trying to get people into it, because the level of numeracy in journalism is just a horrible problem, and it's the easiest way you'll ever have to challenge people and be right, given that we have less information and less time and less money than everyone we deal with. Just having a bit of facility and confidence with numbers is great.
It's not just numbers, is it? I mean, it's not just Excel sheets. You're coding and using...
There's coding, there's scraping, there's the rest of it, but it's amazing how much of it actually just comes down to either knowing financial accounting enough to be quite confident with it. I think Nick does training courses, don't you? So I will collect a fee for that later. Or actually, the basic Excel stuff will get you there 80-90% of the time. It's actually... the rest of it you learn when you need it, and as you get into it, you don't have to suddenly feel like to start doing this stuff you've got to know everything. You've got to sort of try and push to know at least sort of the basics, and then know people who know more to draw on, and each project you learn more and it sort of builds up. The one thing I'd sort of flag with HSBC was it pretty much walked in the door through a journalism non-profit, which we'd done sort of a couple of not decent investigations, but not breakthrough ones with before. It's called the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, because Americans make really catchy names for things. It's the ICIJ. And because we'd worked with them before and we'd really kind of put some resources in some very worthy projects about offshore ownership and all of this, that were fun but not huge. The director of it quite trusted us, and so when he got this stuff, we were sort of the first call to go, do you think this is real? Do you think it checks out? How do you think we would go about doing it? And so went out to Washington sort of vetting it and doing the things you usually do to try and vet, cross-reference it against any other sort of leaks or public domain stuff you have, checking it out. But we essentially got given this because we'd worked well with places before, and because it was too big for anywhere to do. Le Monde got this, dived through it for the French stuff, and initially said, we're going to do it globally, we're Le Monde, we're a big paper. And then they realised it was too complex and they didn't have the local knowledge for any of it. So they'd worked with ICIJ before, they gave it to them. And ICIJ in the end picked about sort of 35 news organisations. And that's not a simple process, and especially when you want to rival each other. But having some of the biggest papers in sort of 30 countries all lead on the same story, and having helped cover the local knowledge. So what we did was share the top lines, and we sort of had a much heavier burden on this because it was a British bank. We did a large share of it, but we didn't share the particularly just niche UK interest stories, even if they're great. Political donors and all of that stuff that actually made it a really good story here. We knew they wouldn't be bothered about that, but we would if we found a really interesting Spanish character who for us was going to be 2 lines, share it with the Spanish sort of partners. We would do the same with the rest of it, and they did it for us. And it's actually, that got us access to about 30, 40 journalists working on something for about 6 months. No news organisation in the world will fund an investigation to that. We had 4 reporters on this, and it was 3 reporters and a freelancer. And even then, actually, only 2 of the people, only me and Juliet Garside, who worked on this, were Guardian staff journalists. David Lee came out of retirement for one final battle. So I mean, if it had been a hokey film, he'd have dropped dead about a week before. But happily for all of us, that did not happen. And we pulled in a freelancer initially, sort of thinking he'd stay on for 3 weeks, and in fact he's still there. So so it worked out for him. But quite small newsroom kind of resources turned into something a lot bigger, and actually I think more and more that kind of collaboration and trying to work out what you have to contribute and why the other place has a reason to work with you is how this stuff happens. And newsrooms don't like it. Like, your editor always is kind of, why can't we just have this on our own? And it's not usually the right way through. And I think places, smaller newsrooms that find ways into that are kind of going to get quite interesting. And I think there's probably ways for small specialist newsrooms and big general ones to team up and kind of swap resources and impact with sort of specialist knowledge and sort of try and dig better on a lot of areas we don't cover well. He says speculatively.
I mean, what's the collaboration process like? Because most journalists they've got reasonable egos. They didn't come into the profession to earn money, so they need their byline. What's the put down your...
It helps to be a calm, self-effacing Mother Teresa type like me, really. No, I mean, essentially, the thing is, early on, you agree some key stuff. You agree sort of the terms of, we won't publish unless we all publish together. We will publish at this time, this date. That won't change without the agreement of everyone. We will share top lines, but we're doing our own reporting. And if that's the ground terms, you then sort of stick to them. You don't try and have sort of something beneath. It will only work at the beginning if everyone feels like they're bringing something to the table and the other places are. If you feel like you're just basically giving something away to someone else, but you think collaboration's good, you will end up falling out with them. You generally keep it quite small, and the key thing I found is you let your bosses talk as little as humanly possible. You find sort of reporters in the other places you can work with, and you try and fix 80-90% of stuff reporter to reporter quite quietly, and you involve your institutions only when you have to, because at that point you're having the big meeting sitting in a room, and that's where everything's a headache. But good God, if WikiLeaks and Assange could keep the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, El País and Der Spiegel in line for 2 weeks of daily publishing, anything is possible. Because, good grief, I'd say I went grey, I kind of obviously didn't, but good God. We would have about 2 screaming rows a day on a good day. I can remember when I was at WikiLeaks, having a screaming fit, pretty much, because I'd been told to. Ian Katz, who was then the deputy editor of The Guardian, who had the day before offered me a job as and when I left WikiLeaks, going, why the fuck have you done that headline saying, will WikiLeaks carry on? They're all going fucking spare that you've broken the deal. What the fuck are you playing at? This is going to fuck up the whole rest of the publication. And Ian Katz very politely and very reasonably pointed out that we hadn't actually put out any press statement saying that we would keep going, and so they had to fill it with nothing. And so 2 minutes later, he said, if you can just do a "we will fight on" type press release, we can put that in the paper. So sort of hung up, realised we hadn't done a press release, went, why don't we start it with something like "we will fight on," sent it over, and wonderfully, 5-column banner headline, "We will fight on, WikiLeaks vows." So, there's those moments where you often realise your fights are that you've forgotten to do something, which is slightly embarrassing. But it is that general thing of, if everyone's got something in it for them, sort of keep the teams in each paper quite small, and if you've got a reporter who you wouldn't want to work with or be in a room with for 3 months, don't try and be in a room for 3 months. There are some incredibly good journalists who I think are brilliant, who like at The Guardian, I've enjoyed sitting near. I would help them out with anything. I would not start a long project with them because we'd kill each other. And part of that's always there too. You've got to pick a team that gets on, as well as sort of just the skills stuff. If you forget the soft skills, it's gone to end badly.
Brilliant. I think we'll come back a little bit later to the nuts and the bolts of how you actually went through all that data, because from what I gather, it was a pretty humbling pile of spreadsheets to go through, massive amount of verification, because I'm quite keen we crack on and make sure everyone can have a chat. But the other thing that I'm also keen that we talk about before you go is what investigations are going to look like at BuzzFeed. So hopefully someone in the audience can bring that up in a few minutes' time. And then I'll pass
If you haven't looked at that, by the way, do. It's great. I had nothing to do with it.
I'm going to pass this little wheelie thing over to George, and we're going to hear a little bit about what George has been up to at the Sunday Times.
Yeah, so how many of you guys are student journalists? Yeah, there's quite a few. How many from City? Everyone from City. And how many from the investigations? Of course. Yeah, that's good, quite a few. Still Rosie Waterhouse? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I thought I'd maybe go into banking and did economics at university, and did some student journalism for a laugh, and really enjoyed it, and didn't enjoy economics so much. So I applied for City University investigative course, and just thought, I didn't know a huge amount about journalism. I've been a sort of sports columnist at the student paper. I don't think I ever made a phone call to anybody, and just kind of gave my fairly poorly informed view on sports events. And somehow Rosie agreed to take me onto a course, and within the first few weeks, Rachel Oldroyd, who's now in charge of the Bureau for Investigations, started up a scholarship for one member of the City investigative course to spend 2 months at the Mail on Sunday, Live magazine, who had a reportage section doing investigative magazine features. And I guess a reflection of how green all the other members of the course were, I managed to get, I was lucky enough to get it. And so it was a seriously steep learning curve. We did a big investigation into child abuse across Britain. It was in the wake of the IBP scandal, and not knowing anything about investigative journalism at all, I had to learn quite quickly. And the only reason I did the investigative course was that I couldn't decide if I wanted to do television or print, and it was the only course in the country that did both. And I didn't really have any appetite at all for doing kind of long-term stuff, but I just by doing the IBP thing, I got quite passionate about it, and sort of instinctively followed your nose on it and kept digging away. And the way I went about it was I worked out after a few weeks that every time that there's a baby dies and they think that there's neglect involved, the council is obliged to produce a serious case review. And so we FOI'd every single council in the country and asked for every single serious case review for the previous 5 years, and built up a database of about 400 serious case reviews, and then went through and found that there was extraordinary correlation between all the failures between the different councils. And so we did a big piece, and that then gave me a kind of in to the Mail, which wasn't my natural politics. But obviously being a student journalist, I was desperate for any job that paid. So at the end of the year, we were all kind of looking at what jobs we might get, which I guess is a situation you guys will be in a few months' time. And so I went for all different trainee schemes, and got onto the Mail one basically off the back of that work. But I felt like a bit of a fraud, because there was a far better journalist on my course than me, and they hadn't got jobs. In fact, the best reporter on our course was a girl called Eleanor Zook, who works on the Grocer. but she just hadn't been selected for the Live magazine thing, and so I guess that's one of the main things. It's a lot down to luck and what you can kind of what you fall into, and then I guess what you make of it. But there was another. We were all going for different jobs. I'd say the trainee schemes obviously have been a great way for me to get into it, but it's increasingly difficult to kind of through that route, I'd say, or it's harder through that route now to get into investigative journalism, because certainly with the Mail scheme, which I think now takes on about 19 a year, took on 7. That's right. Yeah, exactly. So in my year it was 7, and 3 of us got onto the papers after the first year of the training scheme, but the rest all ended up on Mail Online. And working on Mail Online isn't quite what you'd imagine being a journalist would be like. You write 8 stories a day. You rarely make a phone call. You just copy out stories from other publications and rewrite it in the Mail style. And I mean that may be an unfair assessment now, but that was certainly the case with my colleagues. It's fair, okay. But because of the investigative background I'd had in the training, they put me onto the Mail on Sunday because they saw me as someone who could maybe generate my own stories. So I think that's a great it's a great advantage to have that investigative training, because if you get onto a trainee scheme and then it's a decision of whether you go onto the kind of journalism route, you're more likely to get onto the paper jobs where you're doing it, I guess, kind of more old school, as most people would imagine journalism is. So I then spent Mail trainee scheme. I spent a year at the Glasgow Herald, doing a lot of journalism, writing off press releases, 4 or 5 stories a day, and then moved back to London and joined the Mail on Sunday, where obviously some of the stories weren't quite to the agenda that I'd hoped, but did some good stuff. And then they had a lot of money, so they sent me around the world and did some stories that I was quite proud of, looking into the Archbishop of Canterbury's oil career, going to the Central African Republic to report on a case where a British safari worker had been imprisoned for a mass murder that was perpetrated by Joseph Kony, but the Central African Republic authorities were so embarrassed at their failure to control Kony that they blamed it on this Brit. Went to Nigeria, went to Israel to report on Tony Blair's failure to do much as the head of the quartet, and so it was also brutal because as an on-the-road reporter for the Mail, you work all hours and you find it very hard to have a life outside it. Couldn't hold down a relationship. Spent about probably stood up about 5 girls on dates with half an hour's notice, and then I became quite disillusioned with the whole thing because even the Mail on Sunday was having less money to commit to investigations, and I was concerned about the future of journalism. So I was looking at things like corporate intelligence. I was after 3 years at the Mail, so that was about 2012, and then I moved to the Marie Colvin died in Syria, and the Sunday Times announced that they were going to set up a scholarship in her memory, and it was open to young journalists, and it was basically a year's contract on the foreign desk. And I thought, right, I mean, it was a significant pay cut to what I had at the Mail, but I just thought that is the kind of journalism I want to do, and I probably don't have much chance of getting it, but I'll give it a go. And if I have nothing to lose, because I was going to leave journalism anyway. And luckily, I got it, and so moved across 2013. And that's where I come on to the slavery story, because when I was at the Mail on Sunday, the first ever case of someone being trafficked to Britain to have their organs harvested was reported by the Salvation Army, who have the government contract to look after human trafficking victims in Britain. And the Mail, I don't think I've ever written about human trafficking before, thought, God, that really is appalling. So they sent me down to the Salvation Army to try and get an interview with the victim. And unsurprisingly, the victim wasn't too keen to be interviewed by the Mail on Sunday. But I asked about human trafficking in general, and they mentioned that that there were Vietnamese girls being trafficked to Britain to work as manicurists by day in nail bars and as prostitutes by night. But there were lots of anecdotal reports about it, but had never sort of properly managed to nail down. They had a few cases, but they were concerned that it was a much bigger thing. So I pitched it to them out on Sunday, and they said, "Oh yeah, I mean, we have a female readership, and great. This is the one opportunity where our readers will actually come into direct contact with the victims." So I spent about 3 months working on it, and really hard to speaking to all the charities. Do you know any girls who have the same story? Will they talk to me? Lots of them said, yes, we've heard of cases like this, but none of them can speak English. They're all terrified. They won't talk to you. I found out though roughly where in Vietnam these girls were coming from, which was a city in the north. So we sent a journalist out to North Vietnam who found these nail academies where families were spending hundreds of pounds to get their daughters trained up in painting nails, and in the hope that they would travel to Britain and make a fortune in the nail bars here. But little did they know that when they actually got here, they'd be paid nothing. They'd be told that if they complained, they'd be beaten up or reported to the police, because most of them would come over illegally. So I felt like I had enough to write the story, but the Mail never ran it, much to my frustration. But it actually turned out to be a good thing, because when I came to the Sunday Times, I had a ready-made story all there. And I pitched it to the news desk, who initially said maybe 400 words if you're lucky. It was a bit grim. But then I pitched it to the magazine editor, who had had her nails done in a Vietnamese place a month before. So she said, yes, can you do 4,000 words, please? And let's do a campaign on human trafficking. So I said, oh, that sounds great. So I basically spent the last 2 years doing that. So the first story was the magazine piece on the nail bars, and the kind of coup de grace to that piece was they said, look, we'll run it big if you can get a first-hand account of a raid on a nail bar with the police. So I rang around every single police force in Britain, and they all said, this isn't an issue, what are you talking about? We haven't done anything on this at all. Until my last call was to Police Scotland, and they had a very enlightened police chief who'd set up a human trafficking unit, and they actually had a raid planned in Glasgow on a central Glasgow nail bar right on the shopping street. And after a bit of negotiation, they allowed me to come along. So this was a nail bar in Glasgow, and that's a Vietnamese worker there. And this was taken just before the police went in. So that was them going in. And this was this wasn't in Glasgow, but this was a photograph I was sent of a separate nail bar in Suffolk, where they had basically a brothel running in the floors above the nail bar. And they found the women who'd been working as manicurists that day, but had then moved up stairs at night and been forced to work again for no pay as prostitutes. And this is back in Glasgow, and this is the Vietnamese victim who'd been trafficked into Britain illegally, come over on a boat across the Channel, had then been trafficked up to Newcastle, forced to work as a prostitute, and then again up to Glasgow. And as soon as the police went in there, she told them the full story and said, please help. And that was the owner of the nail bar who was arrested. So by luck, actually, I can't. Some people have sort of try and credit us with inspiring the modern slavery bill, but it's complete nonsense. The government, by chance, had been planning a modern slavery bill for probably about a year before, but by lucky chance, my piece came out the week before they planned to announce it, and Theresa May kindly read the piece and said that she was shocked by it, and so she agreed to announce the modern slavery bill in the paper the week after the nail bar piece, and sort of said it was shocking and that kind of thing. So thank you, Theresa, but completely unwarranted. And then she also wrote a piece as well, setting out her plan. And so then on the same day, we then did a second piece about how Vietnamese boys were also being trafficked over on the same boats from the same families, but they were being put in suburban cannabis factories to basically imprisoned, and they never were allowed to leave once they went in there, and they were paid nothing, and the Vietnamese gangs were earning an absolute fortune off the back of it. So then the sort of campaign rolled on, and the aim was to try and inform the government where human trafficking was happening, and so that they would make sure that they put in the right measures in the modern slavery bill to properly tackle it across Britain. So this was a Nigerian girl who was trafficked for sex trafficking in London, and the Vietnamese and the Nigerians are the most commonly trafficked, or the most common source country for trafficking victims in the UK. So then another piece about how the safe houses that the few child victims were actually rescued. 90% of the child victims who are rescued disappear because the traffickers tell them that if they don't come back to them, then their families back at home will be harmed. So basically the complete failure of our authorities to protect the very few victims that they actually bother to rescue. Then we did another piece about the Filipino victims who were trafficked to work in the fish trawlers around Scotland's coast. Hundreds every year, promised vast sums to send back to their families again, and then they leave their families completely abandoned at home, who are waiting for these checks to come back through the post that will allow them to be educated. But then when they get here again, Scottish fishermen, I guess, they're squeezed by the EU quotas, and the profit margins are increasingly being tightened. So there are mitigating factors, but some of the violence that we'd heard that they were suffering was really quite extreme. And that this was on a police raid who went on up in Stranraer, where they were questioning Filipino fishermen about their treatment. And then again the food factories and farms supplying the supermarkets, employing Eastern European victims who it wasn't the factory, it was the factories that were supplying all the major supermarkets, but the factories weren't actually aware of what was going on. The way the traffickers were doing it was they'd bring in dozens of Eastern European workers, again on the promise of high wages. They would then let them set up bank accounts, and they would then steal their bank cards off them. And so they would put them in these houses, maybe with three bedrooms for 20 men, and basically cram them all in. And then they put them to work. And then when the wages came in, they just take the wages out of their account using their bank cards. And if the men complained, they get beaten up. And there've even been a few suspected murders as well from people who properly complained. So this was another surveillance operation we did on a factory where Eastern European victims were being exploited. And that's the kind of conditions that they're living in.
Did you get any of these people who were swiping the cards? Did you kind of?
Yeah. So one of the cases that we looked at was a Lithuanian man who had done exactly this thing. And we worked with, the police have been, historically have been terrible at following this up. And this led one of the charities called Hope for Justice to employ former policemen to set up their own investigative unit. And they actually, and they were the people we actually joined on the surveillance operation. And so what they did was they did all the surveillance, gathered all the evidence, and then they presented it to West Yorkshire Police. And because we were reporting on it, West Yorkshire Police finally decided to actually investigate. And that guy actually became the first ever company owner to be prosecuted for human trafficking in the UK last year. So hopefully there has been some progress as a result. That's just a generic supermarket shop.
I've added a couple of slides on for you.
You have? Okay. So after I did the, I guess I kind of finished doing the human trafficking work end of last year, I guess, and I took a look at Mo Farah. I had a tip-off that there was Mo Farah's camp was or training camp in Portland had unethical unethical doping practices, but it wasn't. The tip wasn't that it was banned. It was that they were being prescribed substances that should have been just for someone who had a medical problem, but they were being given it to enhance their performance. So I started looking into it, and I very quickly realised that Panorama had been looking at this for about 3 years, and I was calling all the same people. But one of the contacts I made through that story was a journalist called Hayo Seppelt, who works for ARD, and is the finest sports doping reporter in the world. And he informed me that he just got hold of, from a whistleblower, the entire database of blood test results for every athlete in the world from 2001 to 2012. And he said, the problem is I haven't got the sheer manpower or time to analyse this. Would you be interested in helping me? I said, I would, very much so. And so this came through in March this year. So we have then spent about 4 months firstly speaking to a lot of experts to work out exactly how you tell whether someone's doping from their blood test results. And then trying to find experts who will be willing to basically put their balls on the line and in the absolute knowledge that they would be absolutely pilloried by the authorities for doing it, but the guys who felt strongly enough that not enough was being done to take the risk. And luckily we found two Australian guys who were willing to do it, who were actually right at the top of their game. And they spent 3 months analysing every single medalist in the endurance events from every World Championship and Olympics from 2001 to 2012. And we didn't know what the results would be. We paid them for their time because it took so long. And our concern was that they come back and they'd say, well, everyone's clean and you wasted your time, there's no story here. But they didn't. They came back and said that a third of all those medalists had suspicious results, and the actual majority of them had such suspicious results that they could rule out every other factor apart from doping. And they also said that the sheer scale of some of the blood test results showed that these athletes should have been in hospital rather than actually competing. So we ran...
Is there any chance you can just give us a 1 sentence or 2 sentence description of what blood doping is?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, of course. There are 2 main forms of blood doping. Both Lance Armstrong has been a key exponent of. One is blood transfusions, which is where you put a drip into your arm about a month before an event, you take out a pint of blood, you then store it in a fridge, for a month, and then 2 days before the event or a day before the event, you re-infuse it back into yourself, which gives you a large amount of much more blood than you would normally have, which therefore allows more oxygen to be carried to your muscles and therefore significantly more energy. The experts reckon that in a 10,000 metre race, that can increase improve your time by up to a minute, which in the last Olympics was the difference between first and last in the final. EPO is the other main form. That is basically taking an injection of a hormone that stimulates the creation of red blood cells, and therefore you again creates far more red blood cells in your body than you would normally have, and therefore again gives you more energy. So both dangerous practices that, as we understand it now, many athletes were doing themselves, injecting themselves, re-infusing it themselves. They were sometimes hooking up the blood bags to re-infuse it back into them on team buses and using the what you normally put your jacket on. So it was it was.
It's worth saying you ruined sport for me. That piece, I remember reading it on the way back from a stag do and wanting to cry. You ruined sport.
Yeah. Well, I started off my career in journalism as a sports columnist because I love sport, and it was shocking and depressing, and it has ruined it for me as well, absolutely. Mainly because if you put a minute onto your 10,000 metre time through this method, I find it difficult. It is now difficult to look at athletes who are winning and really have confidence that they're clean. That's a problem.
I suspect there's going to be a lot of questions about the verification process and all of that. Again, rather like the HSBC stuff, and I'll leave that to everyone else. I think just for time purposes, we're probably going to move on to Nick. Thanks very much for that. That's amazing. Nick, tall built environment journalist, has done a piece recently, a series of pieces focusing on the housing crisis, I've had a preview of these, so it's quite exciting stuff.
Oh, well, steady.
To me.
To housing geeks.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much. So I'm Nick. So I think if you combine James's and George's age, I'm probably still older. I started, my first job was in 1989. I worked on Insurance Age magazine and they had typewriters. When we got computers, I was bashing them like nothing on earth, and got RSI, one of the first cases of RSI, because you had to. I wasn't used to them. I actually earned. I was thinking as I was listening. I earned £8,500 on my first job, and I was telling this to a colleague last year who's now at BuzzFeed, having won Young Journalist of the Year, Tom Warren, who was moaning that he was on the living wage, £19,000 at the Bureau, and getting further into debt. And then, so we did the calculation, and actually he was earning more than me on his first job. So there you go. It was always been shit wages in journalism.
Sorry.
Well, it wasn't actually for the Nationals back in the day. You could do quite well. So I mean, this is all really bleeding obvious stuff. But people talk about different ways of reporting. There's a hypothesis kind of theory of trying to find a hypothesis and then working towards that when you're doing investigative journalism in particular. I've got this knobby little phrase, data plus, which is bleeding obvious, but I try and get new, relevant, headline-grabbing data, case studies, all that shit. That's what I try to do. Just before I go on to that, I suppose career-wise, after Insurance Age, I went freelance after a year and a half, which was a bloody stupid thing to do because I was in my mid-20s and I didn't really know anybody. But I eventually landed up at the Big Issue magazine, which was just starting up, and that was really good. I lasted about 2 years there, then I went a bit of travelling, and then I went to a States Gazette magazine, a States Gazette Interactive actually, which was one of the first B2B online news services, which was really great training for me, and I stayed with the States Gazette. And some of the contacts that I've had then, or made then, I still have and have been really valuable, particularly for the housing stuff that we've done recently. I really think the trade press is fantastic for getting in-depth, specific information. You get to know a sector, and it's held me in good stead, basically. It took me 10 years to get to the national papers. It's where I wanted to be, but it took me 10 years. It's quite a tortuous route. I started selling stories from the States Gazette to pretty much anybody, and then I got shifts and eventually got a job on the business desk of the Observer and stayed there for 11 years doing all sorts of things. I'm going to talk more about the housing stuff because a lot of you in the housing press. I kind of like, instead of the hypothesis way of looking at things, I like kind of these innocent questions that I call them. When if you stand back, we did a project at the Bureau about how much money the City of London has contributed to the Conservative Party coffers, and through that we did a lot of stuff about how financial legislation has been influenced by the lobby. And then you think, well, how big is the financial lobby? People talk about the size of it, so let's try and define that. So, I mean, that's what we did, and we kind of looked at lots of policy documents to see who was feeding into those, looked at lots of registers of PR companies. It's a really nice big office here, so it's obviously a fine industry. And we looked at also all the registers and looked at the client lists of etc. And we managed to kind of get a methodology together, which we had peer reviewed by academics to get a size scale of financial lobby. So we did, as you can see, how much cash has the UK's biggest cities spent on housing people in temporary accommodation in each year since before the last election, which is a good counterpoint to the benefit cuts, and which we'll come on to. So house builders routinely cite viability as a reason to reduce affordable obligations. So what are the profits of UK house builders? Are they a viable industry? And we did a project last year with my former colleague Tom Warren, now at BuzzFeed, about who were the Royal Mail priority investors, and he did some amazingly skillful work looking at going to share registers in order to establish that. Okay, thank you. So this was, it's all through Freedom of Information. We went to the 12 biggest cities in the UK, and we also went to the 32 boroughs, trying to asking them how much money they spent on temporary accommodation in a number of different years, and you can see that the money was rising. This is a couple of years old story, but you can see the money was rising, and we counterpointed that with the amount of savings that were made through benefit caps or rental caps through housing benefit, and actually the two figures, when you add them all up, are not that far apart, and then you kind of equivalent the amount of money spent on temporary accommodation with how many homes you could build. So this was, we did housing, just this isn't kind of for kind of like tweeting, but as you probably know, the Bureau had a big car crash. It was indirectly involved with the McAlpine story, which brought down a Director General of the BBC. Indirectly, well, because it wasn't actually a Bureau story. It was never a Bureau story. That's quite true, and it was a story that someone was seconded into the BBC to do. So only contractually was never a Bureau story. Anyway, we had obviously a terrible reputational hit out of that. So it was thought that a good, worthy subject like housing would be a way of rehabilitating ourselves. And I had. I spent a lot of time on States Gazette magazine in the big issue, so I was in a good place to be that person to do that story. So if we go to the next slide, because I haven't got the zapper. Ooh. Right, now, correct me if I'm wrong, but from our point of view, this was the first tangible evidence of economic and social cleansing of London. We did an FOI looking at the amount of people who've been moved out of borough. Someone can correct me, I don't mind, but we're kind of claiming that at the moment, but this is a good audience to test this theory out. We did an FOI to every single London borough, asking them how many people have they moved out of borough. And you can see the step change. I know subsequently Inside Housing have done stories taking this on, and I think the figure is over 15 or around 15,000 these days.
Heather Spur over there could probably...
Yeah. Well, I think it's a particularly powerful kind of set of data, actually. So we also did an FOIs to work out where these people went to. So those 3 data stories we packaged into one, and they became the first front page story that we had since the McAlpine car crash, and got us back in the game, basically, which was important for the Bureau. So, okay, so we did that, and then the next obvious thing was, well, let's talk about the delivery of affordable housing. You know, there's obviously a massive housing crisis, and let's look at the supply. We could see, obviously, that councils are absolutely, redundant in terms of delivery. It's laughable that they did 2,000 units less than in 2014-15. I mean, it's incredible when you think about it. Housing associations, as you guys all know, have been cut dramatically and are facing a bit of a complete crisis in their direction as to where they're going. And interestingly, private sector actually has held the line. It isn't that dramatically different in terms of the amount of output they've had. But 1975-76 is 130,000, 112,000 now. So anyway, so those were some of the kind of macro data. Once you guys all know this, well, it's kind of a lot of people don't realise that it's the private sector that is the main delivery agent for affordable homes. And you, as I say, I think you're in a bad place when you're relying on people to generate affordable homes when they're actually not going to make that much money or as much money out of them. And you can see, as we did, through this data, that the amount of affordable homes through the most important mechanism was falling. So we thought, well, what's going on here? So, I mean, how many affordable homes, so that made us think, well, how many affordable homes do the UK's biggest housing developments generate? How many affordable homes will one of the UK's biggest single housing schemes generate? And we could see that there was new legislation that allowed house builders to fast track appeals against previous legal agreements. So how many homes have been axed through that method? And most of all this was, again, through FOI, which is why it's such a valuable tool for journalists. And I hope you're all signing petitions and feeding into a consultation period that finishes on the 20th of November to register your support of FOI. Okay. So this was all technical stuff which we helped inform what we were doing. Is about the importance of Section 106, which was the way that affordable homes, as most of you know, comes about. So that was what we had to understand, the history of it. Then we realised that local affordable housing targets exist where local authorities set an amount that they expect to get, amount of affordable homes they expect to get, which is brilliant because that gave us the kind of counterpoint. That meant we could actually have a benchmark which would kind of help the story. And then once we, when we were doing the how many affordable homes does Britain's biggest housing developments generate, we could see going through all the planning papers that it was always viability that was cited as a reason not to meet local affordable housing targets. And this made us kind of go into this amazing system which is there, and I don't know if I need to explain it to you but basically, well, I'll just very quickly, it's all there in the thing, but it's not affordable housing target. It's not a legally enforceable mechanism. It serves as guidance. It's trumped by national planning policy. This states if a developer can prove building affordable homes makes a residential scheme financially unviable, the local authority's target for low-cost homes must be waived or reduced, and that has spawned a really interesting industry of lawyers and consultants and what have you, and that's where the story was. Whoops. So that basically that there is a technical way that it works, which is kind of you get your head around it. It doesn't take too long to get your head around how the viability system works. It's basically all your costs taken away from your revenue, and if you don't get 20% profit out of that, then you can say you're not viable. It's the most important kind of mechanism in housing, because if you can reduce your affordable housing, you can make more money out of your site. Which way am I going? So, through understanding all those kind of frameworks, we could see that 60% of the biggest housing developments currently in the planning system fell short of local affordable housing targets. None of Birmingham's biggest housing developments meet its targets. And less, other than Birmingham, the cities where at least 50% of housing schemes failed to meet their local affordable housing targets were Bristol, Bradford, Cardiff, Manchester and Sheffield. We thought we'd focus on a 10-side development scheme called the Vauxhall 9 Elms Battersea scheme, 195 acres, 30,000 homes earmarked. It ought to be an answer to the London's housing crisis, and yet only 17% were affordable. And we just looked through planning papers to get that figure, and the kind of saviour of that particular line from a Story point of view was that Lambeth, who half of the development fitted into, said that the development to residents, when they were trying to persuade them to accept all the disruption that building would bring, they would see 35% of that affordable. So we could see that actually they were nowhere near that. So we packaged basically that up together, with also a look at the biggest VNED developer, which was one of probably the most successful house builder in the country, Berkeley Homes. Run by, I'm sure most of you know, Tony Pitchley, who's a pugnacious individual, who has very pugnacious lawyers, Harbuttle and is it Lewis? Harbuttle, yes. Yeah, who made their presence felt very keenly with us. Even up to the 10 minutes before printing the story, which we ran with The Guardian, they were almost like that Monty Python character, where all the limbs had been chopped off, and they were still saying, "We're going to sue you, we're going to sue you." Anyway, so they're arguing virtually all of their 10 schemes that meeting the affordable housing targets would stop it meeting industry standard profit margins. But we looked at their accounts and we could see that their margins were absolutely healthy, and they were making after-tax profits of 268 million. And recently, some of you may know that they've managed to get themselves huge dividends. I'm not sure. Do you know what it is? Hundreds of millions of pounds worth of dividends that they have kind of given to themselves. So it's moot as to whether their affordable housing kind of obligations were viable or not in our book. So. Quick one. This was one development that we looked at, and it was really instructive because basically a Singaporean developer pays several £1 million. It's about £6 million. It's on the land registry, which you can see, for an old telecom exchange site in near Vauxhall, and it submits plans for 36 stories, 40% affordable, and then. They get that consented, but then they say that in 2010 the economic crisis makes those figures uneconomic, and they reduce their affordable quota down to 25%, even though London is doing pretty damn well as a market. But still, that gets accepted. And then 3 years later, the developer wants to axe all of the affordable homes. The council pushed back on that, and say that the values are 10% higher, and so they agree 17%. Don't forget that originally it was 40%, so they go down to 17%. Okay, so that gets passed, and then literally weeks after the consent, the whole scheme was sold at 30% higher values than they told the council they were going to get, which made a difference of £20 million. The developer could definitely have afforded more affordable homes, and we kind of saw all that through planning papers and also Property Insiders, one of which was an old Estates Gazette contact of mine, but I had 3 sources kind of saying exactly what the price was for this. Finally, in terms of part of the package that we did on housing, the Shell Centre in Canary Wharf. So this is a scheme. It's 780 luxury flats, 20% affordable, some on-site, some off-site. It was half Lambert's affordable housing target. Now we established the developer was allowed by the council to make a profit of £600 million before it was required to build more than 20% affordable. I mean, that's a lot of money. Whoops. This is how we did it. Right, okay, so we were passed a investor sales brochure, which was very useful. It was written by Knight Frank and Savills, and it was going out to backers of the scheme, and it was a really fascinating document. Within it, it told us how many units were in the scheme, which you could get through planning, but for us, the most important thing was the average size of the units, because then we could times the number of units by the average size to get a gross sellable floor space, which was important. Okay, so there was a publicly available review of a viability report because this scheme went to a planning inquiry, so we could get hold of that. And in that was probably the most crucial figure, which was the residential value that was ascribed by the developer and then challenged by the consultant working for the council. So they put a residential value of £1,275 per square foot, and that was increased to £1,330 by the consultant working for the council. Now, because we had the other document, we could get the square footage of the entire residential element of the scheme, and if you multiplied the residential value with the square footage, you could get a gross residential value. Now, in that review document, they attributed profit margins that they were going to get. So now this is important because we needed to work out how much profit they were going to make in this development. Now, they were saying they were going to make 12.9% at 12.75, so you can see at the back. In case 2, they were saying they were going to make 16.89% at 13.30, which was still below industry standard. So, if they were making 12.9% profit, that meant that their costs would have to be 87.1%. And if they're making 16.89, that meant their costs would have to be 83, because everything that wasn't a profit is going to be cost. So in that way, we could actually calculate how much costs they were going to make. And interestingly, the 2 figures that we made the calculation on were virtually the same, which gave us a lot of confidence. 835 million rather. So we also, in the investor document, we could see that they were going to get 1640. They were hoping to get 1641, so we could see how much revenue they're making. Now, the case 4 was that at the point at which they would have to build more than 20% affordable homes. So that is the most crucial figure. So we had all of it. We were able to make a calculation as to what their total profit in cash was. At first, we calculated it would be £757 million before they built more. And we put that to the company, and they said, oh no, you haven't taken into account all sorts of factors. And we basically negotiated between us as to what was an acceptable figure, which turned out to be £600 million. I don't know if that is clear, but that's how we managed to get that figure. And it took a lot of work, because actually, to be fair, I couldn't get my head around how to do this calculation, and I asked a lot of people in the building industry, and they couldn't get their head around how to do this calculation. And the final person I asked was this bond dealer that I know, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to do bond maths on this. So if that's the profit margin, everything is cost. That's all you need to do." And he just completely found a way through this calculation and made it ridiculously simple, and actually it was the right way of doing it as well. So always go to a bond dealer. Right. Okay.
conscious we want to get some questions.
Okay. The others, I'll be very quick. Basically, we looked at the profit levels of Britain's biggest house builders, and we could see that they were nearly up to what they were in the boom time, which was which made the guys who page lead. We are hopefully going to do more housing, but we haven't done much this year. We did a piece on the Greenwich Millennium and all the affordable housing there. But it's a great time to do housing. It's an important issue and it's right at the top of the agenda, and it's all going Pete Tong, so it's good for journalism. So that's it, really.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Nick. Really appreciate it. I think Gerald is going to swing around with the microphone. So hands in the air, you can hear me. Hands in the air if you'd like to ask a question.
Jennifer is an editor of C&D. I just wondered if there's anything you guys ever regretted publishing, either because of the outcome or because you felt rushed into it by an editor and you didn't feel the story was ready, or just after it had gone you kind of thought, actually, I should have done more on that or investigated something else.
Start with you, James, and we'll shout.
So at the Grocer, we had every page had gone to press except for the main news page, which had our splash on, and the splash fell through, and we were at about 15 minutes to deadline, and we couldn't do what we usually do, which would be bump everything else up because they'd gone to the printer. And so essentially the whole newsroom was told, what the hell can you get that we could credibly have in the splash slot that we can do in 20 minutes. And so we're all scrabbling around because that's the worst thing that can happen. And I found something from the Real Bread campaign sort of saying how terrible industrial bread was because the enzyme they use in the process originally came from pig pancreas. I kind of thought this is something we would normally never touch. We hadn't even nibbed it. Called them up and went, can you guarantee that, like, you know, could it still be coming from pig pancreas now? And they went, well, yeah, maybe. Called Kingsmill, called Hovis, who both refer to the Bread Council. Just kind of rang. It's not the Bread Council, but whatever it's called. Rang the guy who just comes there. He said, well, yeah, you know, enzymes come from all sorts of places. Can you guarantee the British baking industry never gets any of its enzymes from this? Well, of course I can't. Ran bread might contain pork, you know. Be afraid, vegetarians, Muslims, Jewish people. Pig bread. We didn't press release it. You know, we would usually, like, to PA, we would send out the best 3 stories of the week. We'd always send a splash. It filled the slot. We put in a few paragraphs saying it probably isn't, but we had to slightly ham it. Oh, sorry.
Was it an illustrated front page?
It's, yeah. So because we were getting rolling fines, and if you miss your printing slot, you don't get on the trucks, you don't get on the... So you have a massive fine and no issue, and the rest of the issue was perfectly good. And all the nationals picked up the bloody thing. And it was, of course, total bollocks. I mean, it was true enough when we published. No one tried to sue us, no one tried to do anything, but my editor sort of spent the whole Monday fielding furious calls from most of the big food manufacturers. And there was this sort of horrible sort of thing where there was another sort of title at the same publisher, sort of British Baker, which was the B2B sort of baking thing, and she very kindly took me aside and, you know, you're a good young journalist, but you're going to have to learn not to get overexcited and treat these things with some skepticism because it's caused me huge problems. And of course this poor lovely woman sort of trying to be very nice when she could have written the thing out, and me just thinking we all knew it was wrong. So yeah, I still feel quite bad about pig bread.
George?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few of the celebrity stories I have to do at the Mail on Sundays. I wouldn't mind having back. Lily Allen's wedding in particular was when she swore at me and I think 3 other paps. Very recently, when we did the doping scandal, we were advised by the experts just to look at the endurance athletes, and so once we had that ready, we then did the story as soon as we could, because the IAAF were threatening to injunct us, and we were concerned. We weren't 100% sure exactly how that would play out if it ever went to court. But we've now taken a look at the sprinters, and looks like they were also blood doping. So if we had the time, it'd have been great to have done the whole thing. And but I'm sure we'll do that in the future. So
you'll regret not publishing something?
Yeah. Well, to be continued. Yeah. Yeah.
The same bolt? This is a smiling question.
He's clean.
Okay. All right, great. Nick.
In those blood test results.
Okay. I do regret certain stories, particularly there was a business editor at The Observer, I remember, ran a story about a publishing business that I was working in, saying it was up for sale when most people clearly knew it wasn't, because it was making loads of money and the company was doing okay. And I think it fell victim to what James was describing, just the desperate need for a splash, because it was written by this person as the splash of a business section. And when I started working at The Observer, and I was really desperate to get a job, I did take one or two flyers in terms of they are bidding for a certain asset. Somebody's bidding for something. And I wasn't really completely sure whether that was the case or not. And I think that was, I regret doing that, but there was a pressure to deliver, and I found a pressure to put stories out there in order to get my freelance contract negotiated. And so that was, I think I did that, and that was not a good thing to do, but I don't do that anymore. I don't.
Hey, so I'm pretty new to journalism, so this might be kind of question number one on the course, but how do you protect your sources when you know they can be traced back to you?
Sounds like a you question.
Yeah. It's usually about having a realistic idea about who's going to be after them. If they're breaking the law in speaking to you, is it going to be a police force? What are police forces' powers? You should have a decent understanding of what they can and can't ask for. You should try and places train this much worse than they should. One of the interesting things I learned probably a lot later than I should is if you're being arrested, police can search and seize anything in where you're arrested. So if you're arrested just outside your newsroom, that's fine, they can only search you. If you're arrested in your newsroom, they can search your whole desk, your locker, the whole newsroom if they want. And so the lesson being, meet police at reception, don't bring them up into the building. Just routinely, unless you're very sure why they're in the building. But generally, if you're dealing with police, it's Ripper, they might tap your phones, so they might know what phone calls from what. They would take more effort to get in your emails, they would start to need warrants, you'd probably be able to oppose that. If it's the sort of stuff that's got to start touching intelligence agencies, you shouldn't be on email, you should be encrypting, you should be using throwaway stuff. If you try and do maximum security on anything, you'll never speak to anyone ever again. You'll basically just move somewhere and never talk to anyone. So it's about learning realistically who might come after this person. Is it going to be their employer trying to fire them? Is it going to be this person trying to do that? Whenever you put something on a permanent form of communication, just think, firstly, this could end up in court for libel, but this could also end up something I have to hand over. So if you don't have to name your source in a written thing, why bother? In a memo to your editor, anything like that. It's often worth copying your lawyers in on correspondence to say and try and get some legal privilege on it. But an awareness of the law and a realistic idea of, is this police who might come for this? Is this an employer? Well, in ascending order, employer, police, intelligence agencies. And most stuff, the intelligence agencies are not going to be interested in. So you don't have to go at maximum paranoia, but get good at sensible precautions. And that's things like their work, advising them their work computer, their work phone, their work email addresses are not the way to talk to you.
Slightly tweak that question for you two, because I can't imagine the intelligence agencies have necessarily given you quite the same scrutiny James has received, but something that everyone here has mentioned is lawyers. So how many, the stuff that you've done, could it have been done by any of the journalists in this room today, or would you need the might of the Sunday Times or the Guardian or indeed the Bureau with big financial backers to pay those fees? The
modern slavery stuff could have been done by any of you. most of the time we couldn't name victims and that kind of thing to protect them. We had a few dealings with supermarkets, obviously, but it basically just giving them a chance to comment and then fairly putting their response in the piece. The IAAF stuff has been more complicated. The Lord Coe-led IAAF is spent we spent a lot of money, as we understand it, trying to identify our whistleblower, and that's currently ongoing, which we find quite depressing, considering that they're supposed to celebrate whistleblowers. But James has summed that up pretty well in terms of how to protect them. But yeah, I mean, it helps to have lawyers.
Do you use encrypted email? I know James has previously spoken about the importance of doing that. Is that something that you guys use?
Not as a standard, but if we feel it requires it, we do. Perhaps we should.
Okay.
Nick, you use open source intelligence for your inquiries?
Say again?
Open source intelligence for your inquiries?
Well, it's a good place to start, but I probably use human sources the most. So you use open source, you then work out who you need to talk to get the information you need, and then you follow it through. And
very open. I just asked if you used open source intelligence, and yeah, that's it.
Right.
Okay.
Thank
you.
Nick, lawyers, you, Tony Pidgley.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think most of the lawyers I dealt with, I guess, were started at the Observer and the Guardian, and then at the Bureau. I found them generally really excellent and supportive. Right? And on our side, in terms of dealing with the other side, I mean, I've kind of quite enjoy the joust. I think it forces you to up your game and make sure that you got everything in a row. So I've dealt with Philip Green I had phone conversations directly with him for 7 hours in total on one particular story, and it was a kind of a complete joust, and there's a lot of intimidation that goes on, but then at the end of the day, if you're confident that your story and your evidence stacks up, then you should be fine. And interestingly, increasingly, I think people can just use what I think is beginning to be termed the prosecutorial approach to editing, where the editor will just act like the opponent of your story and demand to see evidence to back up your story. And if you produce that, then you're fine, and in fact can reduces lawyers' fees. And I know, in particular in the developing world, I know there's a really cool organisation called the African Network of Investigative Centres of Reporters, ANSIR, which is not very catchy, but the people who run that don't use lawyers. They do some badass stories, and but lawyers can be our friends.
Investigative journalists are terrible at naming things. You might noticed.
Thanks, Gerald. First of all, I just wanted to say I'm tremendously impressed by the amount of work that you guys have put in and the time that it takes for you to develop a story. My name's Jeremy Dodd. I'm a public relations person, experienced in crisis management PR, and the problems that I tend to have had have been where journalists have chosen not to put the time in to make a conclusion and then obviously try and print it, and I've worked very hard to stop that from happening. And some of the best sort of results that I've had when there's been a problem have been when journalists have actually taken the time. And I'll single out Building magazine, in this case, the excellent Thomas Lane at the time, who I worked with very carefully to create a 2-page article about a building problem in a property development that I was working on. And the result was fair and accurate, and as a professional PR, very happy to support that sort of journalism. I think I might sort of take issue with Nick on some of his viability points. As a property developer PR, having sort of survived through the recession, We do need to bear in mind that Barratt and Taylor Wimpey, between the two of them, had 3 billion quid's worth of debt, and I think Taylor Wimpey's shares went down to 10p. And I think the number of people that lost their jobs during that period doesn't have to be forgotten about either. One particular scheme that I was involved with was a 3,000 unit development in a county town where there was a huge shortage of housing, and pre-recession, when property values were high, when land values were high, there was a deal done with Section 106 for 40% social housing, which was totally and utterly unviable on anybody's view. During 2009-2010, the developer would have been happy to develop some of that land if they could have negotiated a lower percentage. But of course, it didn't happen. The council wouldn't play ball. It went to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State wouldn't play ball. And as the managing director of the development said...
Is there a question, Jeremy?
Yeah. Sorry. The question is... The question is that what I would ask you to do is to actually have a...
That's not a question. That's a request.
It sounds a bit like a speech.
It's a request. Maybe it is a speech. But just thank you for your sort of statistical skills, and thank you.
No.
Okay, thanks very much.
I'd just like to say though that the house builders did buy land at silly money, and it's not society's fault that they did that, and they also merged and acquired companies at the top of the market, which a number of them were paying the price for. So that was a market issue rather than a social issue.
I have a suspicion this might be exactly the kind of conversation that would work out beautifully with a pint in the...
okay, and I think that's a very good point to break, because I'm conscious of time. Thank you all. Thank you all very much indeed. Now,
we can grab
Nick, you're going across the road to the pub. Which pub is it?
We're off to the Albert for anyone who's still
We're
thirsty.
off to the Albert. Do take your questions with you and join. Is everybody from the panel going?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Press gang.
Do join the panel. If you've got any more questions, do ask them. Can we please do the usual? What a fantastic panel. What an insightful... I mean, there were so many case studies that I don't know where to even start. Can we please thank them? And I particularly like to thank Nick Duxbury, the Executive Editor of Inside Building, who brought this all together. And thank you for coming. You don't have to go, you just have to move. Thank you very much. If you want to do more of this, get in contact with us through LinkedIn. Tell us what you think about tonight. Tell us what you want to talk about, and we'll see if we can organise it. Thank you very much.